Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by Jenny Gilruth on education statistics and the 2026 National Improvement Framework. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary. Up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, this summer, when Scotland's exam results were published, we were able to declare 2025 a landmark year for Scotland's young people's success and achievements. This year's results delivered increased attainment across National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher levels, a narrowing of the poverty-related attainment gap at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher levels, and over 100,000 technical and vocational qualifications being achieved for the first time ever. The publication of statistics today across a wide range of metrics in early learning and in school education reinforce that improvement trajectory. Post-pandemic, today's statistics show real evidence of recovery and progress across our education system, and I hope that is something that all members will be able to welcome today. The achievement of Curriculum for Excellence levels data is the most comprehensive national data set on attainment in literacy and in numeracy, and importantly, it is predicated on teacher judgment. Today's publication confirms in our primary schools levels of literacy attainment have increased to the highest level on record at 74.5%. It's 0.5 percentage points above the previous high. For numeracy, attainment remains at record levels of 80.3%, and in our secondary schools, the proportion of S3 pupils achieving fourth level in both literacy and in numeracy are at a record high of 63.1% and 68% respectively. Presiding Officer, there has also been significant progress to close the poverty-related attainment gap. The gap has reduced to its lowest ever level for primary pupils in literacy. The gap has reduced to its lowest ever level for primary pupils in numeracy, and the gap has reduced to its lowest ever level for S3 pupils in both literacy and in numeracy. This shows our long-term investment in Scottish education, such as in the Scottish Attainment Challenge, is delivering tangible improvements and outcomes for our young people. The challenge has had a transformative impact on Scottish education. It has changed the culture, the narrative and the awareness of equity and the impact of poverty on education over the past 10 years. SAC has been able to support our schools and our local authorities in driving improved outcomes for children and young people impacted by poverty. We know that recovery from the pandemic has been challenging. Across the globe, education systems have struggled to return to post-pandemic or pre-pandemic normality following prolonged lockdown periods. UNESCO report that the pandemic affected more than 1.6 billion students and youth globally, with the most vulnerable learners being hit the hardest. We know that in Scotland, young people and their families have struggled. Today's data suggests, however, that we are turning a corner on education recovery with improvements across the board. Indeed, attendance of children and young people in school has increased. There has been further consolidated improvement in school attendance, now at a rate of 91%, with a decrease also in levels of persistent absence of approximately 3 percentage points. Our recent national marketing campaign on school attendance has been supporting improvements. More directly, however, individual schools have been focused on supporting families and young people in returning to formal education post-pandemic. Across the country, Scotland's head teachers are today using a variety of interventions to support their young people with improved attendance. For example, in the employment of family liaison officers, as I witnessed recently at Pathhead Primary School in Kirkcaldy. And these improved outcomes, Presiding Officer, are a testament to the diligence and commitment of our children, our young people and our teachers and all of our school staff. We should all be rightly proud of them today. These significant achievements also provide a clear indication that the choices and investments made by this SNP government are supporting better outcomes for our pupils. We chose in 2014 to create an entitlement to fully funded early learning and childcare for every 3- and 4-year-old. This September, nearly every eligible child aged 3 and 4 was registered for funded provision, ensuring that they get the best start in life. If families paid for their full 1140 hours entitlement themselves, it would have cost them more than £6,000 per year for each eligible child. However, there is more to do to make sure that every child gets the best possible start in life. It is disappointing that the proportion of 2-year-olds eligible for early learning and childcare has fallen nationally. It is also concerning that there was a decrease in attainment in Primary 1 level. These children are, in effect, Scotland's COVID babies. We must not allow the longer-term impact of the pandemic to hold them back. The pandemic must not become a defining feature of their young lives. This government remains absolutely determined to leave no child behind. I have therefore requested urgent advice from our Primary Head Teacher National Panel to intensify and enhance support for this intake and the ones yet to come. I have also asked Education Scotland to consider how to enhance support for them as part of our work on the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and to provide a report which I can share with the Parliament's Education and Young People Committee, and I will ask the new Chief Inspector, once appointed, to look specifically at this issue. To increase uptake of early learning and childcare among eligible 2-year-olds, we are funding a post within the Improvement Service to deliver intensive support to 5 local authorities under a national improvement project on maximising uptake. That's in Falkirk, Glasgow, North Ayrshire, North Lanarkshire and in Aberdeenshire. And, Presiding Officer, I know that colleagues will be mindful today of the rise in the percentage of children and young people with an identified additional support need. Today's data confirms a 2.5% point increase nationally, although in schools across the country I recognise that figure is often higher and dependent on the cohort. I have welcomed the constructive dialogue with members across the Chamber on additional support needs, and with thanks to Willie Rennie for the initial suggestion, I can advise Parliament that work has begun on a national event for teachers to showcase successful approaches to promote best practice. This event will mirror the approach of the Early Years Collaborative, promoting the expertise of those at the chalkface to help share good practice of what is working well. Following a successful ASN Data Summit in November, I am today launching a programme of data improvement work on additional support for learning. This programme will focus on 3 key areas. Firstly, a review of existing categories for recording additional support needs. Secondly, clear and concise national guidance to support the recording of ASN data. And thirdly, developed options for gathering data on local staged intervention models and reporting those at national level. This will in turn inform the feasibility of a national staged intervention model for identifying, assessing, planning and better supporting children, young people and their families. This work will fully involve education authorities, given that they are our delivery partners for additional support for learning responsibilities and duties. A final updated additional support for learning action plan and progress report will be published at the end of this parliamentary term, and I intend that final progress report will be accompanied by a short, sharp review which will be professionally led and will reflect on the changed context in our schools since the Morgan Review and establishment of the Additional Support for Learning Action Plan. It will focus on the lessons learned from that process and the next steps with a view to closing the implementation gap. It's also worth reminding ourselves that Scotland's schools continue to deliver high-quality learning and teaching. Of the 120 inspections carried out by the Independent Inspectorate in publicly funded schools between August of 2024 and June of 2025, 93% were satisfactory or better, and 76% of schools inspected were rated as good, very good or excellent for wellbeing, equality and inclusion. Thanks to the efforts of Scotland's local authorities, today's census data shows an overall increase in the number of teachers for the first time since 2022. The pupil-teacher ratio has improved as a result of this investment, which was made possible through support from the Scottish Government's budget last year. Extra funding in last year's budget uplifted the ring-fence funding for teacher numbers to £186.5 million and provided our councils with an extra £28 million, specifically to support additional support needs. I am therefore pleased to see an increase in the overall proportion of probationer teachers in permanent or temporary teaching posts, increasing this year to 69% from 65% last year. However, we do need to see sustained improvement now on permanent posts. Presiding Officer, the wide range of data published today demonstrates that our education system is delivering sustained improvements across the board. Improved attainment, a narrowing attainment gap, improved attendance and more teachers in our schools to support Scotland's young people. In 2025, the National Improvement Framework set out that in the short term, our focus would be on improvements in the ABCs, attendance, attainment, behaviour and curriculum in our schools. This focus has supported clear improvements in relatively short order, and is also delivering on our longer-term vision of excellence and equity. The National Improvement Framework for 2026, published alongside these statistics today, builds on that same approach. Our International Council of Education Advisors has consistently advised that we should focus on these incremental improvements in our education system. They are indicative of that longer-term shift towards a culture of improvement. Again, there are real signs that in the exam results this summer and in the data published today, this longer-term shift is happening. That is to be celebrated. The foundations of our education system are robust and our plans for improvement build consistently on evidence of progress. Nearly every eligible 3- and 4-year-old in the country is benefiting from fully funded early learning and childcare. In our primary schools, more children than ever before are achieving the expected levels of literacy and numeracy. Attainment rates at all levels of school qualifications increased this year for our young people. Importantly, we are delivering equity for those who need it most. Closing the poverty-related attainment gap has a key role to play in achieving this government's commitment to eradicate child poverty. Our children's attendance in school has increased again. The gap in literacy and numeracy levels between primary-aged children from the most deprived and the least deprived communities is at its lowest level ever, and a record number of 18-year-olds from deprived areas secured a university place in 2025. Presiding Officer, there is of course more to do to realise our ambitions for Scotland's children and young people, but today demonstrates what the SNP in government delivers. Promises being kept, progress being made, success being nurtured, opportunity being fostered, and a better future for all of our children. Thank you.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. And I'd be grateful if all members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Miles Briggs.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by welcoming Paul O'Kane to his position as Labour Party spokesperson. The third last sentence of the Cabinet Secretary's statement claimed promises being kept. And amazingly, the Cabinet Secretary managed to state that whilst keeping a straight face to Parliament today. Because, Presiding Officer, the facts speak for the reality, and that is that teacher numbers remain a historic low in our country. When the SNP first took power in 2007, there were just over 55,000 teachers in Scotland. That total has been lower in every single subsequent year. In the run-up to the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, SNP ministers pledged to employ an additional 3,500 teachers and classroom assistants. Again, another pledge not kept. Voters will know when they go to the polls in May that SNP promises on teacher numbers have been broken, and you cannot trust the SNP on education. And I welcome in the statement the work the Cabinet's outlined around ASN. I think that's important, and that's because Scottish Conservatives brought forward a vote to Parliament to deliver it. But we need action, not just words. However, the biggest failure in this statement today is the broken promise on eradicating, not just closing, eradicating the attainment gap. More than a decade on from Nicola Sturgeon's flagship pledge, there remains a chasm between the most and least deprived kids in our country when it comes to basic literacy and numeracy. For too many pupils, they are being failed, and we're failing to meet the expectations of the basic education system should be delivering for them. Presiding Officer, if SNP ministers can take credit for anything today, it is the ability to try to spin a record of failure. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary one question? If she today will be honest with the teaching profession across our country and admit that the SNP pledge on teacher numbers will now not be met.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Miles Briggs for his question. I have to say, Presiding Officer, I find it remarkable that he wasn't able to welcome a single measure that was announced today from his comments there. This is as a result of the hard work of Scotland's teachers and our pupils, and the success that we have seen across the board in relation to attainment, attendance and more broadly in terms of the gap narrowing is to be welcomed. I do want to come to some of the points that Mr Briggs has raised. In terms of teacher numbers, of course, it is worthwhile reminding Parliament that since 2014, teacher numbers have increased by over 2,500 thanks to investment from this government. In the previous year's budget, of course, the government put in a direct intervention to protect teacher numbers. So we uplifted the ring-fence funding to £186.5 million, and we provided local authorities with an extra £28 million to support additional support needs. Of course, the Conservatives chose to vote against that investment, which in itself speaks to some of the challenge in that regard. And in relation to teacher employment, of course, it's worthwhile welcoming. There was an increase in the teacher induction scheme probationers securing a teaching post in the year following their probation, up to 69% compared to 65% last year. Again, as a result of this investment. I'm pleased that Mr Briggs has welcomed the action in relation to additional support needs, and of course that has been informed by some of the cross-party working in that regard. And in terms of the attainment gap, we've seen progress again in this year's statistics of the gap narrowing across a range of different measures. But no commentary, of course, from Mr Briggs today on the impact of austerity policies followed by his party when they were in power and the impact that has had on our education system across the board. Speak to any head teacher, presiding officer, and you will hear about how poverty is corroding the progress that is being made in our schools as a direct result of those policies and that approach. So I will not make any apologies for the approach of this government. It is delivering progress, it is delivering improvements across the board, and I wish the Conservatives could bring themselves to welcome that good news for Scotland's children and young people.
Paul Kane.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement? Can I note that I am looking forward to my interactions with her and her ministerial team, and indeed with colleagues across the chamber as I take on this new role. And indeed, what is clear is the way there is progress being made by the hard work and dedication of our teachers, our young people and our parents, then that will receive welcome and constructive commentary from this side of the chamber. But where the government continues to fail, we will continue to point that out without fear or favour. And the Cabinet Secretary stood here today and spoke about promises kept. Well, if the defining promise of the 2016 Parliament was closing the poverty attainment gap, then the reality is that the promise of this Parliament was to be COVID recovery in our schools. But we're told now by this Cabinet Secretary that we're just turning a corner. With less than 3 months of this session of Parliament to go, we're turning a corner and we're on a trajectory of progress. But the reality is that our schools are still far behind where they were before the pandemic. We have heard about teacher numbers and the failure to deliver that promise. On attendance, despite a fractional increase on last year, we still remain 2% below the pre-COVID average, with unauthorised and persistent absence well above pre-COVID averages. And moreover, the government has allowed a postcode lottery to develop, where in places like East Ayrshire, attendance rates are the lowest in the country, yet down the road in South Ayrshire, attendance rates are above the national average. On attainment, the Cabinet Secretary selectively claims that the combined measure for the attainment gap on numeracy in our primary schools is the lowest it's ever been. But for primary fours, that crucial transition, the halfway point of a child's journey in primary education, that attainment gap has significantly worsened. So isn't the real truth and the overarching truth today that John Swinney and the SNP's stated mission of COVID recovery in education has failed, completely failed? And what is this Cabinet Secretary going to do other than pat herself on the back? Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I welcome Paul O'Kane to his position. I note that he has welcomed the progress today, and he's also talked about the constructive approach that he will take in his new role. So I look forward to that engagement. He provides challenge here, and I'm happy to talk to some of that. He mentions, for example, the challenge in relation to attendance. I absolutely accept that. The government's been taking forward a range of different measures on this. I instructed the Chief Inspector on this matter 2 years ago now to take forward very focused work with local authorities. He quite rightly also spoke to the postcode approach to different local authority areas and the variance we see in the system. I have to say to the member that is a feature of Scotland's education system, with 32 local authorities running our schools. However, that is not a reason for it not to be further improved, which is why, of course, we launched the... Well, if the member will listen, I hear him chanting from a sedentary position.
Let's hear one another. Thank you, colleagues. Cabinet Secretary.
The national marketing campaign, as I mentioned, Presiding Officer, was launched last month and ran, of course, and has been helping to support some of improvements in this place. The member mentioned the attainment gap. I have mentioned today some of the narrowing that we've seen in relation to this data. It's reduced in literacy in 24-25 to its lowest ever level, to 19.4%. And for primary numeracy, the gap has also reduced to its lowest ever level. Undoubtedly, there are challenges in the system which do relate to the pandemic and do relate to some of the points I made in response to Mr Briggs. I think we need to intensify progress, which is why I've set out a range of measures today in that regard. And of course, the new Chief Inspector, when appointed, will have a key role in driving that improvement.
Bill Kidd, to be followed by Ros McCall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, as you've mentioned, actually, among primary pupils in Scotland, the poverty-related attainment gap in literacy and numeracy has reduced to its lowest ever level, and that was in 2024-25. Can I ask, how is the Government going to continue to combat the poverty-related attainment gap?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank the member for his question. I am delighted to see the progress that he has spoken to across the board. And in relation to the action the Government has taken, the Government has given an undertaking that we will continue the Scottish Attainment Challenge. Of course, it will be a matter for the next Government to decide upon a policy approach. But it is a policy approach that we, I think, have seen evidence of today, delivering improvements in our schools as a direct result of that additionality the Scottish Government has provided, whether that be through the Pupil Equity Fund or through the Scottish Attainment Challenge. The extra staff, for example, in our schools are making a huge difference. I mentioned the primary school in Kirkcaldy earlier on, whereby I saw the employment of a family liaison officer. Other head teachers take different approaches. Across the country, we see around 3,000 extra staff being employed in these roles as a result of that additionality from this Government, which is making a key difference and in driving that improvement.
Ros McCall, to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I also welcome Paul O'Kane to his new role. I note the reference to the early years funding in the statement and the subsequent request for advice from primary head teachers' national panel considering the decrease in attainment at primary 1 level. And I also welcome the request that the new Chief Inspector, when appointed, look specifically at this issue and that the Government remains determined to leave no child behind. But the Government hasn't addressed the funding model, which is causing disparity in provision and a postcode lottery where some parents are actually prevented from accessing childcare in the most suitable to their needs and to the needs of their child. So when will the Cabinet Secretary finally address this issue so that the early years funding model actually guarantees no child is left behind?
Cabinet Secretary.
Ros McCall for her question, and I think it is imperative that we focus on these primary 1 pupils, the COVID babies, as I mentioned in my statement, and intensify the progress in that regard. We are looking at a programme of work across Government at the current time, myself and Ms Dawn Innes, of course, who leads on ELC as Children's Minister, to intensify some of that progress. The member will also have seen some of the uptake dip in relation to our eligible 2-year-olds in the statistics today. So again, we need to work with local authority partners on that, and I will be meeting with them in the coming days to talk to further progress and how we might be able to intensify that further.
Jackie Dunbar, to be followed by Martin Whitfield.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With almost all 3- and 4-year-olds across Scotland reaping the benefits of funded ELC, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to set out exactly how this is benefiting young folk and their families?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I set out previously, Presiding Officer, high-quality childcare is really absolutely vital in giving our children the best possible start in life, but it also helps to ensure that parents and carers can work, train or study. That's why Scotland's offer is available to all 3- and 4-year-olds, regardless of their parents' working status. I'm very pleased to see further evidence that uptake remains near universal for this age group. Independent research back in 2022 found that 74% of parents and carers said that funded ELC had enabled them to work or look for work, while 63% of families with preschool child aged 2 to 5 stated that they had no childcare costs as a result. We will publish a full evaluation report on the expansion in early 2026.
Martin Whitfield, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer. We heard at time for reflection today that democracy requires humility. So can I ask for an answer to Miles Briggs' question? Will this SNP government keep its promise of 3,500 more teachers by the end of this Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. I didn't quite catch time for reflection as I was coming in. In relation to humility, there is much humility from the statistics today around about where we need to drive improvements. Of course, we heard from Mr Whitfield's colleague about the requirements around about attendance, about the engagement I've had with Ros McCall in relation to our children and young people who are aged 2 and the uptake of ELC. And in terms of teacher numbers, as I outlined in my response previously, we've seen an increase in teacher numbers this year. I thought that that would be welcomed by the Labour Party. Of course, the Labour Party weren't able to bring themselves to vote for the Government's budget last year, and the investment which has sat alongside driving that increase in teacher numbers. So it's interesting that Mr Whitfield comes to the Chamber today to talk about humility, and yet he doesn't appear to have any answers himself.
Thank you, Rona Mackay, to be followed by Willie Rennie. Let's hear one another, colleagues. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, for primary pupils, we've seen the proportion of pupils achieving the expected curriculum for excellent levels in literacy increase to the highest levels to date. How do you reflect on what this achievement tells us about Scotland's education system at present?
Through the Chair always, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I do thank Rona Mackay for her question. I think it is worthwhile us celebrating that improvement that we've seen, particularly in relation to literacy, as the member has set out the highest level to date. We are seeing those clear improvements, such as in literacy, but also in relatively short order. That tells us that the education system is on the right track. That's being supported by the investment through the teaching workforce that's previously been mentioned, the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and the key national programmes on literacy and numeracy. It's now really important, though, that we press ahead with our further reforms to curriculum and also to our qualification system and towards that longer-term vision of that globally respected and empowered education system.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by David Torrance.
So 10 years ago, the then First Minister promised that by now the poverty-related attainment gap would be closed. That was Nicola Sturgeon. That was her defining mission. But that Nicola Sturgeon can't even be bothered to turn up today to see thousands of young people's futures being betrayed by this government. For numeracy in primary, at this rate of progress, it will take 133 years for that gap to close. So without hiding behind staff and pupils, when exactly was the Education Secretary planning to apologise to those thousands of young people?
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, Presiding Officer, I find it remarkable that Mr Rennie is not able to welcome some of the progress we have seen today across the board at every level. This is about celebrating our children and young people's achievements, but I do accept the challenge in relation to intensifying the progress, which is exactly why, I can hear the member heckling again from a sedentary position, but I spoke to the issues that we are taking forward with the Chief Inspector, who will be leading on intensifying this progress that we have seen. We are also mindful of our primary one pupils, and I spoke to Ms McCall about this earlier on in relation to how we can intensify that work. But let's look at the figures from today, Presiding Officer. The poverty-related attainment gap for primary pupils in literacy reduced in 24-25 to its lowest ever level. Our exam results this year show progress of a narrowing attainment gap across the board. So the interventions we are putting in place are making a difference. I accept the challenge from Mr Rennie, though, on the need for intensification, which is exactly what the Chief Inspector will be taking forward. David Torrance, to be followed by Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Poverty-related attainment gap for S3 pupils in literacy and numeracy reduced in 2024-25 to our lowest levels ever. What is the Cabinet Secretary's assessment of this achievement, and will she join me in paying tribute to our teachers for making this possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Torrance for his question, and of course he speaks quite rightly to the achievements of our teachers in driving this progress forward. I noticed that no one has yet, Presiding Officer, today commented on the fact that the ASIL data is informed by teacher judgment, and I think that's an important factor in how we arrive at these measurements across our education system. We trust Scotland's teachers to support the improvements we need to see in our schools, and of course as a direct result of investment from the Scottish Government, we've been able to increase the numbers of staff in our schools, not just teachers. So people like educational psychologists, for example, people like family liaison workers and ASN staff have been supported through additional investment from this Scottish Government. And I will absolutely join David Torrance in paying tribute to our school staff who have helped to support the improvements that we are all welcoming today.
Douglas Ross, to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Murray has the highest level of teacher absences anywhere in Scotland. Councillor Derek Ross has described this as shocking, and Councillor Mark McRae has asked if Murray teachers are living in fear. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for her response to Murray Council having the highest level of teacher absences in Scotland? And given she has so far refused to answer the question twice, can I try a third time? Yes or no? Will the SNP deliver their manifesto commitment on teacher numbers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I thank Mr Ross for his question. Of course, he will be aware that I began my teaching career in Elgin High School in his constituency in Murray, and I found it to be a very supportive environment as a probationary teacher many, many years ago now. I am concerned about the statistics he shares with me today in relation to teacher absence. I think I set out in my statement that Ms Robinson and I, as Finance Secretary, will be meeting with COSLA in the coming days to talk to some of the figures that we are seeing, particularly in relation to variance across the board in terms of teacher employment, but I will also raise the issue with COSLA directly in relation to Murray to understand further about the detail. If the member is able to share any more with me on that, I'm more than happy to consider that. And in relation to teacher numbers, Presiding Officer, I have set out the interventions the Government has taken in relation to our in relation to the budget. And of course, those interventions through the budget last year have led to an increase in teacher numbers this year for the first time since 2022.
Colin Beattie.
It's very pleasing to hear that teacher numbers have increased. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government intends to work with local authorities and other partners to build on this?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's important that we do work with our local authority partners in relation to the improvements we've seen across the board, but particularly in relation to teacher employment. We've heard from members, I think, today that as a common theme. The Education and Childcare Assurance Board, which was established as a result of the Verity House Agreement with local government, is the opportunity for government to do and undertake that work. And really, we are looking at more strategic approaches to teacher workforce planning, which, to the member's question, will help to inform how we drive improvements and more teaching jobs in the future.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. There will be a brief pause before we move on to the next item of business.